So the first seal, when the first seal is open, a white horse and rider comes out. Now, we're kind of jumping the gun a little bit, because I'm going to have us jump forward in Revelation a little bit. Obviously not something that they necessarily would have thought of. Right? They're sitting there listening to it. It's read in its order. But in trying to identify who this rider is, some people have said, well, if we look at chapter 19, I think we have the identification of this rider. So if somebody would turn to chapter 19 and read for us verse 11.
And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat on him is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes men.
So, in thinking about this from the standpoint of somebody studying, people have said the next time we see a rider on a white horse is in chapter 19. And in that case, if you take the time to read it a little bit further, it's Jesus. And so is this first rider Jesus? Or at least somebody who's on the side of good? Because the second, third, and fourth seals represent things that are negative. So is this first one a positive rider, separate from the other three, or should we understand it as somebody other than Jesus? And the evidence that's used to suggest that this is Jesus includes Revelation chapter 19, right, rider on a white horse. Other people will point to chapter 14 and verse 4, which talks about the Son of Man sitting on a white cloud, right, so it's emphasized white cloud, with a crown on, carrying a weapon, commanded to act by an angelic being. Right? And so similar types of circumstances. Riding on something white, wearing a crown, carrying a weapon, commanded to do something by an angelic being. So the first evidence is other pictures of what we know of as Jesus, or fairly certain of as Jesus, that would be similar. Second is the fact that Jesus is a conqueror. And so the rider on the white horse is commanded to go and conquer. So that kind of is presented as further justification. The color white, as it's used throughout Revelation, is, except for perhaps this one, right? This is the one we're asking about. But every other situation, white is used in a good sense. Right? And white is the robes that the saints are wearing. The white that Jesus wears at the beginning. And then finally, the last thing that people point to suggest that this rider is a good, on the forces of good, is that there's no clear woe associated with this rider. And I mean woe in the sense of W-O-E, right? Something bad, not woe in the sense of a rider trying to stop his horse. In the second, third, and fourth, there's something terrible that comes after the activity of that rider. In this case, there isn't. And so that people say that's why we should think of this as Christ or somebody working for Christ. Other people have said that, well, conquering is sometimes used to describe what satanic forces do against the saints in Revelation. Right? And so people are engaged in conquering the saints. A second thing has to do with the Old Testament imagery, like from the book of Zechariah. Right? Colored horses were all together conceptually. They were all working together. So here we have to say, well, these three are working together, and here's this other one off by himself. But even if we look at the first four seals, they seem like conceptual unity. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, not 1, and then 2, 3, 4. So they seem to be all connected together. And then finally, this doesn't necessarily sway the case for this person being negative, but it does kind of suggest maybe a little bit too paradoxical to think about. So, who's opening this seal? All right, the Lamb, Jesus. So Christ is opening a seal, and out comes Christ. How does that all work? But given some of the other strange things in Revelation, maybe that doesn't finally bring it completely over. For my reading of Revelation, I don't think we necessarily have to assume that this rider on a white horse is Christ. Nor do we have to assume that this rider on the white horse is positive. Instead, I think we should see it as that conceptual unity of all four of those first seals being connected together. But, other people, of course, disagree with that, and I think make some points. I don't think they're not persuasive enough for me, but they do make some good points about other pictures in Revelation. So we might not be able to necessarily pinpoint the identity of this white horse rider, but there are some things that we can note about him. First of all, he has a bow. All right, so we get the image of, let's say, a ancient cavalry figure, right? Somebody who's going to be shooting a bow and arrow from horseback, and so there is that sense of military action, violence, something connected here. He is going out to use this. Another aspect of this picture is that he is wearing a crown. The crown here is the Stephanos crown, the victory crown. The rider on the white horse, in chapter 19, will have the diadema crown. Will have the crown of royalty. We'll actually have many diademas. So this is the victory crown. So the rider is going to be successful in what he's called to do. But note that the rider, the crown, was given to him. Several times here in this chapter, the passive voice is used to suggest that the things like this crown are not coming from the riders, but are being given to them. Now, in using the passive voice like this, the crown was given to him. What does that communicate? In the context of all we're thinking about in chapters 4, 5, and 6.
That the victory is not ours.
Okay.
Someone else gives it to us.
Okay, that might be part of it. What else?
God has chosen Jesus to be his ruler, just like when he's given a lot of iron, he's given a crown.
Okay, and so whether this is Jesus or not, the passive voice is kind of, God's the one that's choosing to do this. God's the one that's allowing this. And so the crown was given to him suggests that God's the one in control of this. This rider or any of the other riders do not operate outside of God's purview, God's permission. And the rider, as we already mentioned, comes out conquering and to conquer. And so there's this military mission of sorts that this rider is given. Some people have suggested that the imagery behind this first seal is the imagery of the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire was a federation of tribes located just outside the eastern border of the Roman Empire, and often was kind of the scare tactic, right? I mean, there was a lot of concern about the Parthian Empire. Several times Rome had tried to push out further east, and the Parthians had beaten them back. As recently as the year 62. They were known for their cavalry usage and their bow usage, right? And so the image that serves here might be the image of the Parthian soldier, a formidable enemy. And so whoever this rider is, the image here is of military forces, maybe even invading forces, or an expression of the human desire for violence and power. And so that's a lot of what's connected here with this first seal. Questions? Comments? I don't think that we need to go much further, right? Well, it's a bow, and so the bow was, I don't think we need to push that far.
Each individual area.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't want to push these too far, but I think we can get the general idea. There's something militarily going on here. The second seal is opened by the Lamb, and out comes a red horse. The rider on the red horse is permitted to take peace from the earth, is the way John phrases it. But thinking of this within the context of this symbol, red horse, permitted to take peace from the earth, what's being represented here? War, right? Bloodshed, right? You have a horse the color of blood. And so there's which kind of follows from military action, right? When you have military action, you're going to have war and bloodshed. And especially important for the Romans in this early first century time was the Pax Romana, right? The peace of Rome. That was a very important concept for the Romans, right? The Roman Empire had brought peace to their world. But what's being suggested here is that that peace is about to be disturbed, right? Because here comes this rider who is permitted to take peace from the earth. He's going to take it. Specifically, he would encourage people to slaughter each other. Now, some people have suggested that what is occurring here is warnings to Christians, and that the slaughter is going to be directed towards Christians, that they're going to be persecuted. I don't think that's actually the case. I think instead that the people who are going to be slaughtered are the persecutors. Because when we think of the sixth seal especially, and the fifth seal as well, there's a lot of focus on the judgment of the people who are working against God's people, the people that are persecuting God's people. So this is instead a warning about what would happen to the persecutors, not a warning that this persecution is coming. The rider on the red horse is given a great sword. There were various different types of swords that a Roman soldier, for example, might carry. The great sword was the largest, which of course makes sense in the context of war and bloodshed that we're talking about. But notice again, that passive. He was given a large sword, or a great sword. And so this idea of, these things are occurring with the permission of God. So outside invaders, violence within, or outside invaders leading to violence within, brings about the third horse. So the third seal is open. Out comes a black horse and a rider on that horse. This rider is given a pair of scales. Now, we've looked at the first two horses, with a bow, sword. What do you think is being communicated by seeing this? Out comes this horse, a rider and horse, and the rider has a pair of scales. All right, so the idea of the weighing and balance of justice, right? And so, the scales of justice. So maybe one thing there is this idea of he's going to be involved in some sort of judgment. What else might scales have to do with?
It goes on to talk about goods and making sure that these goods are where they need to be.
Yeah, so there's weighing something, right? If you were buying commodities like grain, wheat, other things like that, it would be weighed out, and depending on how much something was, that would determine how much you would charge for it. Especially given what we're seeing in these next sentences, there might be the idea of something being rationing out, right? You're only getting a certain amount, making sure someone doesn't get too much. And that's reflected in the voice that comes out to the writer to talk about a quart of wheat for a day's pay, 3 quarts of wheat for a day's pay. Some translations have the term denarius. The denarius was a Roman coin that was the equivalent to a day's wage. So if you were a common laborer, you worked your day, you got a denarius. So other newer translations has just said for a day's pay. So a quart of wheat for a day's pay, 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay. Now, I don't know when the last time was when you bought wheat or barley, but are these good prices or bad prices? It seems like 1 quart of wheat for a day, you work your entire day and you can only afford a quart of wheat, that's really high. Yes, the normal day's wage for a laborer would buy 8 to 16 times as much as what is reflected here. Right? And so prices have exploded. We're talking about inflation. Now, why? What would lead to these kind of prices? Thinking about in the context of some of the stuff we've been talking about, what possibly could lead to those kind of prices?
Less workers who work fields means that they don't get work and less production.
All right, so the number of people, that's a good guess. What else?
Less of it.
Okay, which is called shortage or famine. Right? And so it could be that lack of workers that can't get harvested. It could be that the supply is down because there's just not enough there. So we've seen military violence, bloodshed, now perhaps famine. And famine of the staples. These were the kind of grains that were very important for people. Barley, of course, less expensive, but also less nutritious. It wasn't as good as wheat. The poor, though, were the ones that ate barley. The rich, the wealthier, are the ones that ate wheat, but both prices will skyrocket. However, there's this rather interesting comment. Right? So the writer's given kind of the pay scale that's coming, but the writer's not to damage the oil and the wine. Now, several people have tried to come up with explanations for why the oil and the wine are spared. And many of them don't seem to be that convincing. So some people have suggested, the oil and the wine are spared because they're for the prosperous people in society. Well, really, God would make sure that the rich were taken care of? That doesn't seem like how God works. Other people have said the use of oil and wine in religious practices, right? Anointing the sick, the use of wine in communion, and so that's why the oil and wine are spared. That too doesn't seem like it's that convincing. So I think the suggestion that I think makes the most sense is that the famine's not going to be total. It's not going to be a total famine, but it is going to be rather significant. And it's going to have some significant impact. Because ultimately, given the prices, a day laborer wouldn't be able to afford oil or wine after making sure your family had enough grain. So whether the wine or the oil is spared is not going to be very much of an impact to a regular person. One of the things, though, I think definitely comes out of this is the idea of Rome cannot guarantee prosperity. The kind of things that lead to these kinds of situations can happen without any sort of government control. The government can't control when a famine is going to strike. Now, sometimes governments can cause famine, but there's other situations where things will happen and the government can't take care of it. And so Rome cannot guarantee their prosperity. A reminder to those Christians who are thinking of accommodating some of the culture around them, the pagan culture around them. So, invaders, bloodshed, famine, ultimately leading up to the Pale Rider.